I want to begin with just a further introduction about who you're getting. Now, if you were to have anybody come up to the podium and talk about suffering and hope, one of the things that I would hope that we would want them to do is to let you know who you're listening to. Because anybody who would be in this position would be coming to the podium with a certain set of assumptions about the nature of the world that we believe that we're living in. And we don't all, and maybe some of us in this room don't all believe that we're living in the same world. That's possible. But I want to let you know the world that I think that we're living in, so that when I offer other reflections, you won't wonder whether or not this is some bait and switch operation. You won't wonder, why is he talking about God? Why is he talking about any of these things? I would want you to know right out of the gate who it is that you're listening to. So I'll just say this, that I come with a set of assumptions. And the first assumption that I make is that I'm a creature, that I've been made. Now, of course, my parents were involved in all that, right? Sex and everything, because sex is usually involved in these kinds of things. So my parents were involved, but I didn't ask, I didn't make myself. I believe that I'm a creature. I'm made. And I'm made by a God who loves us. I'm made by a God who made us because God loves us. He doesn't love us because he made us because he loves us. And he longs for us. The mission of the God who has made us is that we become men and women who are creating beauty and goodness in the world. We are called to create and curate beauty and goodness in the world. This is what we are called to do. And for those of us who are Jesus followers, which I am, we would say that we learn this, as we learn lots of things from everybody else, we learn this on the first 2 pages of the Bible. Remember, I'm just telling you who I am. Because on the first page of the Bible, we learn that one of the things that we are called to be, if we're going to be like God, if we're made to be like God, we are made first and foremost to be artists. You might not think that that's what the first page of the Bible talks about. That's exactly what we're called to be. Everything that we're doing in your profession, in the classroom, in the research, you are creating beauty and goodness in the world. This is what we're called to be. But we're not just called to do this in isolation as individuals. We are called to do this together with other people who are different than who we are. And we are called to do this in connection with those people who are different than who we are, not just men and women, but of different cultures and so forth. But we are also called to do this recognizing that the most durable and the most beautiful acts of creativity take place in actions that are greatly vulnerable and in situations in which shame, the neurophysiologic activity of shame, is not able to be in charge of the conversation. That's on the second page of the Bible. You might not be aware that that's there. You go read it, you'll figure it out. So, this is who we are called to be. We are called to be creators and curators of beauty and goodness in the world. Now, you'd think that that's a pretty good idea. But then you get to the third page of the Bible. Some of you might have heard of a person or persons named Adam and Eve. Now, whether you believe that they really lived or didn't isn't really the point. The point is that when you read that story, you can look at it and say, oh, this is us. We are people who are really good at hiding. We are really people who are good at throwing other people under the bus. We're really good at people. We're good at like not answering questions directly. Are you with me? This is who we are. Now, this is not our best selves. This is not who we want to be, but this is who we often are. The more anxious I am, the more likely I am to say, the woman you gave me. We are intended to create and curate and become objects of beauty and goodness in the world. But trauma and our shame undoes all of this. It undoes it all. And we who are Jesus followers would say that God has not given up on his mission still for us to become this kind of a people. And so at the end of the day, we say that this person, Jesus, comes into the world, and there's so much goodness and so much beauty in his life that we killed him. Now, we who are Jesus followers also believe that we don't live in a neutral universe. We believe that there is something called evil, and evil is afoot. And evil has an intention of devouring us. And evil's intention is to devour you and everything that you are serving to create and curate. And evil thought that on Good Friday the story was done. and we who follow Jesus would say, evil didn't see Easter coming. And that new life comes because we believe that a new heaven and earth is coming, and God has invited us to join him in welcoming that forward. Now, I want to say, that's just the story that I believe that we're living in. We haven't gotten to suffering. We haven't gotten to mechanics, which we'll get to in just a moment. But this is who you're listening to, somebody who believes that story. That makes sense? Okay. In my work, what we would say is that when we practice psychiatry, we are not just talking about the story that we're living in, we're talking about the mechanics within which that story operates. All of science is a study of mechanics of all kinds of things. Whether you're talking sociology, whether you're talking quantum mechanics, we're talking about what are the mechanics by which we operate. Science tells us how, it does not tell us about teleology. It does not tell us about why, it does not tell us about intentionality, it does not tell us about purpose. In fact, we might even say, as Michael Polanyi, the famous physical chemist and later philosopher of science, said, there is no such thing as science. There are only scientists. Science doesn't tell us anything, only people tell us things, which is really crucially important when it comes to who are the people in our lives who are telling us the things that we believe are true about our world. Are you with me? We who practice psychiatry, especially in the world of the mechanics of what we call interpersonal neurobiology, believe that the mind is something akin to what follows. This is about mechanics. This is not about purpose. This is not about why. This is about what do we talk about when we talk about the mind. When I was in medical school and in residency in psychiatry, I did not only did I not have a lecture, I didn't have a course on what the mind is. This is a problem. You would think, if you're any orthopedic surgeons here? No, they wouldn't. No, they're not here. The surgeons are they're like busy working. They're busy working. If you're an orthopedic surgeon, one would think that you would know what an osteocyte is, you would know what a bone is before you're going to do your work. Psychiatry doesn't often tell us what the mind is. Now, we know a lot about psychopathology. I can tell you what's wrong when people are not doing well. It's not necessarily as easy for me to tell you what the mind actually is or what it looks like when it's flourishing. But here we go. We would say that the mind is an embodied and relational process that emerges from within and between brains, whose task it is to regulate the flow of energy and information. Now, since you're all academics, I don't need to explain this. You get that. The mind is embodied. The mind is not just my brain. When we're anxious, we know it not just because my brain doesn't actually sense much of anything. I sense that I'm anxious because I sense it in my body. My mind is an embodied and relational process. When a newborn comes into the world, we like to say, every newborn comes into the world looking for someone looking for her, looking for someone looking for him. We are primed to be looking to be seen. But those 100 billion neurons in that little newborn's brain are only going to fire about 15 to 20% of them are only going to fire on their own so that the newborn can do what she's ready to do. The other 80 to 85% of those neurons are going to require the interaction with another human brain in order for them to do what they're supposed to do. We need the presence of other people in order for our minds to develop. So my mind is both embodied and it is relational. That emerges, right? It's not just static, it's emerging over time. We become more than the sum of our parts. It emerges from within and between you and me. And its purpose is to regulate the flow of energy and information. All the energy that is the neurobiochemical stuff that's going on within me and within you and between us is taking place. We are trying to regulate that flow of energy and information. By information, we mean that we as human creatures are continually working to make sense of what we sense. First we sense, and then we make sense of what we sense. This is an overly simplified way of talking about it, but we like to say that the mind, the brain, operates bottom to top and right to left. It's an overly simplified way of saying it, but we are continually sensing things, both from inside my body and outside my body, coming from within me and between you and me, and then I'm telling a story about it, and I can't not do this. We're all telling stories even right now. Some of you right now are thinking you're telling a story, I should have gone to the bathroom. Because now I'm sitting in that table, and to get up and leave for the bathroom, he's going to say, you're leaving for the bathroom, aren't you? Right? We're telling all kinds of stories. Some of them are large stories, like that, because going to the bathroom can be really important. But some of them are even bigger stories. I don't believe my father will ever love me. I don't think I can tolerate the rheumatoid arthritis one more day. I cannot live with my depression. I cannot live with my spouse. Because we see that in the middle of all this that's taking place, all of this emerging, embodied, relational process in which we're trying to make sense of what we sense. Thank you, thank you. I'm trying to make sense of that. That's right. That's right. They're telling a story, aren't they? That's right. Somebody's birthday. In the middle of all this, what we are really trying to do with all of this activity of the mind is that we are moving toward what we call, in the field of interpersonal neurobiology, we're moving toward what we call states of integration. The mind has lots of different operating systems, lots of different domains, 9 of them that we won't go into detail about. We have 9 different domains. It's like a 9-section orchestra. Whether we talk about my body, whether we talk about my vertical function, whether we talk about my memory, whether we talk about my attention, whether we talk about a range of different things. All these different forms, all these different domains, it's like a 9-section orchestra. If you can imagine that a symphony has many different sections, and when those sections are really practicing their music well, they're well differentiated. But those well differentiated systems need to talk to other sections of the orchestra. And so they can't just play on their own. They have to listen to other sections of the orchestra. My memory, talking to my state of mind, talking to the way I time travel, and so forth, all the different things that are happening. But once again, in order for me to flourish, in order for me to be integrated, again, these are mechanics, in order for me to be integrated, I necessarily have to have interaction with other human brains in order for this to happen. I cannot do this on my own. Are you with me? And so here's what's important for us to recognize, that if we are designed, if we are intended, if the story that we're living in, create and curate beauty and goodness in the world, do this with others, because in the process you're moving towards states of integration. What trauma and shame do is shatters all of that. And we come to find that the mind runs into a buzzsaw with all kinds of things, in which any number of these different forms, any number of these different systems, of these different domains, are impaired, or they are left unconnected with someone else. Unconnected within ourselves, unconnected between us and other people. And one of the things that we discover that trauma does is that trauma shatters the capacity for the different parts of the orchestra to talk to one another. This happens interpersonally, this happens neurobiologically. You have a fight with anybody here married to the person, you married to somebody here in the room? Are you sitting at the same table with them? Okay, and thank you for acknowledging that. Like, we have fights. And when we have fights, we feel it in our bodies. We don't, it's not like, gosh, I hope I can have a fight with my spouse today. So like, well, I'm really looking forward to that at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. No, nobody does that. You would come to see me if you were doing that, right? These are not what we're trying to do. But the point is this, that when we are traumatized in this way, we find ourselves separating from one another. And I don't just separate from you, but certain parts of my mind start to separate from themselves. And I then have to burn energy to contain all of that distress. And that is energy that I do not have available to create beauty and goodness in the world. Are you with me? Suffering, technically, when you look at the literature, one of the ways that we talk about suffering is what happens when we are experiencing pain and we respond to it over time. You could have an excruciating event of pain, and if it's only going to last 10 seconds, That's a very different kind of experience of that pain than if it's going to last 10 years. Suffering is not just about the pain that I have, it's my response to it over time. Is that pretty clear? But one of the things that separates human beings from other animals is not just that we experience pain over time, it's as soon as we do, we start to tell stories about it. I start to become aware and I ask the question, how long is this going to last? I can assure you a squirrel I don't think is asking this question. Are you with me? I wonder, because I can tell time in ways that no other creature does. I tell time, and the fact that I can tell time affects how I'm anticipating the experience that I'm having, creating greater anxiety, because primarily of something else that my brain does. I always am looking to be connected to people, mostly when I'm in the middle of my most painful circumstances. And what trauma tends to do, it tends to separate me from myself and me from you. One of the things that the pandemic did, it didn't just cause isolation, it pulled the curtain back on the isolation that we as a culture have been ascending into for the last 30 years. Bless you. This is not new, it's just new to us that we're paying attention to it. And so when we talk about how this is going to be how are we going to respond to this thing that we call suffering? There are lots of ways that we can talk about this, and as a Jesus follower, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that, like, there are lots of different ways that we can respond. And I'm going to, this book that I wrote back in August, it is a response that actually invites us to look at a particular text from one of St. Paul's letters to the church at Rome. You're like, what's that got to do with neuroscience? What does that have to do with mechanics? It doesn't have anything to do with mechanics per se. But when we start to think about the text with mechanics in mind, we start to see things. And the text goes like this. Therefore, because of faith you've been justified, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have gained access into this grace in which we now stand, this grace of being loved. And we hope in the glory of God. Not only that, we glory in our suffering because suffering leads to perseverance, and perseverance leads to character, and character leads to hope, and hope does not put us to shame because of the love of God that has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. Now, I don't expect anybody else here in this room to be familiar with that text, let alone to be able to say it. But I want us to pay attention to some things. When Paul says, therefore, since we have been justified by faith, what is faith? Faith is about trusting, and trusting is about attachment. We begin to respond to suffering first by asking the question, what are our attachment structures like? We first want to ask the question, to whom are you deeply known? Of you who are in this room, could you give me the names of 3 people who, if I were to have a conversation with them, they could tell me collectively everything there is to know about you? Are you that deeply known? And by this, I don't mean just they know about you. They don't just know, vital statistics. But we have the experience of in a community being seen, soothed, safe, secure, such that before anything else, even when pain comes, I have a different experience of that pain because I know that when the pain comes, you're not leaving the room. Remember that for human beings, there is that one haunting sentence on the 2nd page of the Bible. Haunting. God is going along, doing his creative work. If you've ever read the 2nd chapter of Genesis. And he pauses and looks at Adam and says, it's not good for the man to be alone. It's a haunting sentence because everything about our suffering is primarily a function of isolation. It does not mean that when we are not isolated, there will be no more pain, but I will tell you that the degree to which we actually suffer has everything to do to what degree do I have the sense that no matter how bad my pain gets, you're coming for me. I'm not being left alone. And the pandemic put us in a position in which everybody was alone. The thing is, we'd been alone for a long time, we just didn't know it. And then Paul gets to this notion that, like, you have peace with God. Like, if you're connected, you have peace. If we think about what we often in psychiatry and psychotherapy, where we talk about this system of understanding the internal mind in terms of what we call internal family systems. Some of you in this room might be familiar with this notion that in our minds, if we were to say, well, you're a daughter or a son because you're a man or a woman, but you might be a father or a husband or a wife. But that's not all that you are. You also have a part of you that gets angry. And you have a part of you that's really proud of things. You have a part of you that gets really sad about things. You have a part of you that's a really great pickleball player. My wife retired in June. She plays pickleball 3 times a week. Like, I got to retire. We have different parts of us that make up an internal family. I have a part of me. My parents were 45 when I was born in 1962. And I had 3 older brothers. They were 18, 16, 11 years old. And like my 18-year-old brother went off to college, and like I was born the next week. And so he could, yeah, you're shaking your head like, Right. I mean, so was everybody else. They're wondering, Lewis, Betty, what are you doing? Well, we know what you're doing, but like what right? And so my brother comes back at Thanksgiving. He's like, what's this? What, right? My father grew up as the firstborn of 3 kids who was far brighter than he was given credit for, never went to college, and was a guy who was like a man of integrity, man who loved his kids and loved his family, but he was also a guy that you didn't cross. We like to say in our family, my dad was not an angry guy, and the reason that he wasn't is because everybody was working so hard to not piss him off. My mom, the 4th of 4 kids, her mother died when she was 3 from an ectopic pregnancy complication. Her father, though he was really bright and really well-educated and well-heeled, couldn't tolerate raising his 4 kids, and so he had them farmed out. My mother basically became like an orphan, going from house to house to house to house, until she finally landed in the home of an aunt who systematically was repeatedly taken off to the psychiatric hospital in fits of bipolar psychosis. My mother would wake up and she would be gone, and her primary attachment figure was not there. And so I grew up in a house in which 2 lovely people, anything that is good about my life, like sits at the feet of my parents. And at the same time, I grew up being really afraid of being angry. And I grew up being like, I'm making sure that nobody is going to be anxious, because I ended up regulating my mother's anxiety for a long time. Like, I started my psychiatric training very young. But what does this mean? This means that there's a part of me that is always worried about the people who are anxious in the room. And that part, when I sense that you're anxious, I'm going to come into the room, and I'm going to make sure that we're going to do everything we can to make sure that you're okay, even if it costs me myself. And what we discover is that, like, we have all kinds of parts of us that believe that we are at war with ourselves and we don't know this. Are you with me? And I would suggest that even in this room tonight, even as I'm saying this, you are imagining parts of you that you really believe are still at war with the world. And St. Paul comes along and says, you're not at war with God anymore. And this is difficult for us to believe because I worked so hard to keep those parts of me out of the room. He goes on then to talk about why it is that we can then, because of this secure attachment with God. Notice, this isn't a guy who's writing prescriptively. He's not saying you have to think this. This is a guy who's had this experience. This is a guy who's already suffered deeply. And he's saying, because I'm attached relationally. This is not a religious thing that I know in my head. This is not about a theological idea that I'm just trying to connect to. This is a viscerally felt, relationally felt experience that tells me that even when I'm suffering, because I'm attached, I can continue to persevere. Suffering is not about the presence of pain, it's about the absence of connection. And if I'm connected to you, as we like to say, the brain can do a lot of hard things for a really long time, as long as it doesn't have to do it by itself. And if we persevere, we access all the neuroplastic change that we've now in the last 30 years discovered that the brain is able to do. When I was in medical school, when we were in the neurology unit at the VA, and somebody has a stroke, we're in the hospital for 6 weeks and we say goodbye and good luck. Now if you have a stroke, we send you to a rehab center where for every hour that you're awake, you are doing work, because we are accessing parts of the brain that we didn't think the brain could do that kind of work. So we're doing things that we didn't used to because neuroplastically, if we are going to persevere together, we recognize that we are going to continue to practice being present with each other, even in the presence of pain that doesn't stop. And so suffering, again, is something that in the biblical narrative is actually honored. It is not, we wouldn't say it's a good thing. It's not, God doesn't think it's a good idea, but it is a thing that even when we pay attention to it in this way, and that it drives us to connection in community, it means that even those things that are painful for us give us opportunity to continue to practice allowing ourselves to be ever more deeply loved when evil would want to devour us in the same moment. With perseverance comes character. Character is the outgrowth of what we do when we persevere in the presence of suffering. Character, there are lots of, in the literature, there's lots of different ways that you could talk about character, but in general, we, in psychiatry and in psychology, we talk about character as being those enduring traits of who a person actually is. But it's important to know this, that character actually isn't a thing that we ourselves are often very able to tell about ourselves. Right? I mean, like I tell people, I don't know what people would say about me. I know what people do say about me, especially when I was in Ann Arbor. Okay, I know that. Bunch of pagans. Right. I'm kidding. Not really. Okay. But I don't know what people would say about me, but I know that I would say, like one thing I say, like I am like a professional sinner. I figure if you're good at something and you've done it for a long time, you can call yourself a pro. You've heard of the 10 Commandments? Have you heard of those things? Some of you? Like 2 people have heard of the 10 Commandments. Right. Look, I'm glad that there aren't like 15. Or can you imagine how much confession I would have to be making? Because there's not just 10. There are all these things. I look at my character and like the closer we get to the light, the more we see of ourselves. It just feels so broken. And so it's important for us to recognize that character isn't something that we necessarily always decide about ourselves. It's what other people begin to see because of how we've been persevering in community that's vulnerable in the presence of suffering. And character becomes a durable trait that then leads to hope. And here's the last thing I'll say. Hope is often a thing in our world that we hope happens to us. We think that hope is a thing that just falls into my lap. Most things, as it turns out, are things, when it comes to hope, are things that we are actually already hoping for, whether you know it or not. For instance, when you stand up to leave, you're hoping that the floor will hold. You don't know that that's what you're doing, but that's exactly what the mind is doing. Most of what your hope activity is involved in has to do with lower brain structures that are not part of the middle prefrontal cortex, consciously telling you what you're going to do. Most of your hope activity is automatized stuff. But we know when things start to feel hopeless. But hope primarily is a future state function of the mind. I hope something that's happening in 5 minutes, in 5 years, in 5 decades. I'm hoping for a national championship, right, next year. We hope in the future. But here's something that's important to know about the way the mind works. We remember our futures. The brain remembers its future. Everything that we do when we anticipate the future is based on neural networks that have already given you experience about what you've had that becomes the anticipated future that you are anticipating. Are you with me? Which means hope is not a thing that just automatically happens or doesn't. It is a thing that I form by practicing perseveringly in the middle of painful things in the presence of others who are not leaving the room. And so when I discover that you are willing to love me in the face of my story, no matter what it is, whether it's my medical condition, my psychiatric condition, my broken home condition, all the things for which we suffer, if I have the experience of your not leaving the room, I begin to anticipate a future in which, even if the pain continues, I anticipate that someone will be with me in that moment. And that becomes the future that is hopeful for me, not because it's magically happening, but because we are forming it together even now. Are you with me? I know I sound like a Baptist preacher up here. Like, are you with me? Did somebody say amen? I attend a church where they talk to the preacher. So suddenly the room grows quiet. If you're religious folks, you're probably all just Presbyterians, except for that gentleman back there. So here's what I want to leave us with. We desperately, but no more so than Adam and Eve needed, we desperately need to know that we are being loved by people who are not going to leave the room. The question is not, am I going to suffer? The question is, who is going to be with me when I do? And when this happens, I begin to practice perseveringly, and in so doing, change the neural networks of my mind, because it is not just a thing that I think with, it is my embodied and relational process. And we do so because, especially we Christians, believe that there is a God who loves us who is behind all of this. But even if we don't believe in that God in that story, it doesn't change the fact that that's what your brain is doing. And as we move here, even on this university campus, to pay attention to the question of who are the communities, what are the communities that we can develop that can enable people to know that people are not going to be left alone in the room, that will enable them to know that hope is a thing that they can, with agency, form with practice. To live into a hope of a future of beauty and goodness. You've been very kind. Thank you for listening.